If you're in that camp of conventional dual cab ute aficionados where the ute rides high and the nuts swing low, even though you'll probably never see them again because they're on the other side of your increasing beer gut. If you're in that camp and you already think you know some stuff about the bare knuckle physics of performance and powertrains and power and torque and what that all really means, I'm going to upend that a little bit for you by bringing you to the next level of understanding on that, because you can't just take what you already know as benchmarks for conventional dual cabs and port them across into this new segment of plug-in hybrid utes. And that's what we're going to talk about now, especially since Ford has gotten off its RS and last week released the pricing and specifications on the Ranger plug-in hybrid, giving us a trio of contenders for what you might want to spend the big bucks on. And every way I carve this up, there's always an orphan, and it depends how you carve it up as to which one the orphan is. Now, I'll be pointing this and that out. During this presentation, I'll be using the beautiful King Dick 19 and 21 millimetre ratcheting podger to jam the point home. So satisfying. Quality tool too. I'd love to know the backstory about the inspiration for the name King Dick, because back then, it's not as if the name Elon Musk was already taken. Go figure. So, the first observation I'd make is that if you're in a drag race, Ranger's the orphan, because 207 kilowatts versus 321 for the Shark 6 and 300 for the GWM, it's not a contest, is it? You know which one the orphan is there. It's obvious, right? And then if you're looking at sort of steady state uphill, dragging that beautiful aluminium and plastic porter slum with your effluent his and hers commingled from outback shithole to outback shithole, then the Shark 6 is kind of the orphan, because the other two are going to go substantially better in the mid-range. And we're going to do a lot of talk about torque in this video, because torque, QUE, is more important, I would argue, for real-world performance than the peak power figure, which is only really important for drag racing and possibly for overtaking a really, really long truck up a steep hill or something. So it's useful for that, but at most times you're not going to access peak power in yo dual cab. The other way to arrange an orphan here is to look at powertrains, because the Shark 6 has a completely different style of powertrain than the other two. The Ranger and the GWM have what you might think of as a more conventional style combustion side of the powertrain. They've got a combustion engine and a multi-speed transmission and low range and diff locks, which for the blue singlet set, I would argue, is something that they would be going, yes, all over town. So if you're going to be doing a bunch of off-roading, difficult off-roading, not just driving down some fire trail, they'll all do that, obviously. But if you're going to be doing a lot of serious off-roading, low range, slogging up and down hills and all of that stuff, then the Shark 6 is clearly the orphan there. And it's interesting to me that so many people have jumped for the Shark 6, perhaps because they didn't know about the other two, or perhaps because they wanted this philosophically different powertrain. And I wonder how some of those people, at least, are going to feel when the Ranger and the GWM get out of the blocks with their superior capabilities in some ways. I'm not saying the Shark 6 is a dog. I'm saying it's less suitable for some applications than the other two. And Vicky Verka as well, dude, because it really does depend on you. When we drill down into this powertrain, okay, because I think torque, QUE, is more important to most people, because at mid-revs, it's a barometer of power. We'll get to that. But let's look at how that breaks down. We're talking about, with the Shark 6, because it doesn't have a mechanical drive from the combustion engine to the wheels below 60 or 70 kilometres an hour. I mean, it does above that, but not below that where you'll be using it off-road. It's just electrically driven. So if you want to access its maximum torque, it's all electric, 650 Newton metres from dead stopped to about 60 or 70 in extremis, when you're really going for it. That's what you're going to get in terms of the peak torque up to and including this 321 kilowatts, right? So that's a substantial amount of get up and go, but in an off-road sense, it's going to depend on exactly how the calibration goes for how it puts its power to the ground and what it does when it feels like the electric motors are stalling, and what the propeller heads have done with the software, which Australia's silver medal winning auto expert Paul Marrick, hi Paul, he found that out when he took the Shark 6 off-road at the proving ground. And that was kind of interesting, not as interesting as the depleted battery scenario, which we will get to, but if you're talking about combustion engine only, it's 260 newton metres from the Shark 6, but kind of irrelevant if you're driving below 60 or 70 kilometres an hour because it's all electric. If you look at the Ranger, it's clearly the orphan on drag racing, but it's quite okay in the mid-range in between the Shark 6 and the GWM. It's roughly 50 newton metres each way of peak torque above and below, to get to the GWM, obviously in front, and the Shark 6 lagging, but for comparative purposes, 600 newton metres is the peak from the 3 litre V6 turbo diesel in the Ranger and 583 from the Raptor with its 3 litre V6 petrol engine. So either one of the, well, any of these, either pertaining to two or any of the three, which would be a better way to say that, are going to be beyond adequate for normal driving with a reasonable state of charge in the battery. It's pretty obvious, okay? The range is making like 411 newton metres from the combustion engine, and that means that if the total system power peak occurs here at these revs for the 411, then the electrical side has to contribute 286 newton metres to make up the total, okay? And if the revs are slightly mismatched, it means that the electrical side will have to contribute more torque than that to make up this peak, obviously, because this only occurs at 2700 RPM. And with the GWM, obviously 380 newton metres from its four-cylinder engine, which is slightly behind the Ranger in a sense, but when you look at it, it's got such a bigger battery, it's easier for the GWM to stump up this additional 370 newton metres that it needs to make it 750 newton metres. And obviously, once again, if you look at the peak power from the two benchmarks, which would be the Raptor and the V6 3 litre diesel, 302 kilowatts from the petrol Raptor and 184 kilowatts of peak power from the V6 diesel Ranger, which is well behind any of these, all right? Not so well behind maybe the Ranger plug-in hybrid, but, you know, at least in terms of the V6 diesel, but well behind the GWM and the Shark 6. So with that in mind, I want to drill down into the complexity of all of this stuff, and I want to tell you why torque is probably more important to most would-be buyers than ultimate power. This is what it looks like when your high-performance pen dies out of the blocks. You grab the black one and it just dies, so yeah. Mid-range torque, meaning torque in the mid-rev range that you'd be driving at most of the time, which probably coincides to peak torque with maximum accelerator. You've got to remember that your accelerator is also one of those tools that varies the power and torque output at the crankshaft, right? So all of those figures you see on a graph occur against a balancing load with flat out throttle, quote unquote throttle. I know some of you will say diesels don't have throttles, that's true. I just mean maximum performance demand from the driver. And in any case, most modern diesels have throttles to facilitate the EGR to get a bit more vacuum happening to flow from the exhaust system back into the inlet. So anyway, this mid-range, mid-rev range torque, which is in all the brochures, it's maximum torque, which occurs in the middle rev ranges. It's a pretty solid ghetto estimate for mid-range power. And the reason you have to distinguish between power and torque is that torque is absolutely useless on its own, except if you're, I don't know, tightening up head bolts or wheel nuts or something of that nature. But if you actually want to make a vehicle accelerate or drive at a fixed speed up a slope, what you need is power. And power is the time rate of change of torque, which is the same thing as the time rate of change of energy. Don't worry about that. Torque and energy aren't directly equivalent, but they're the same kind of thing, and they work in exactly this way. So what you're going to notice is that manufacturers always talk about peak torque and peak power, and peak torque is more useful generally than peak power when it comes to understanding how your vehicle goes in the real world. And this is common if somebody's only ever driven a V6 petrol sort of four-wheel drive. What they'll notice is they get more flat-out acceleration, like drag racing and accelerating to overtake, but they notice that the vehicle feels more effortless when it's just cruising, like it just lopes up hills, and it doesn't seem to bog down very much because it's got so much more torque at lower revs, which means it makes more power than the equivalent petrol engine at those low revs. And that's why you feel different when you drive a diesel vehicle. And you're going to feel different when you drive one of these plug-in hybrids as well, because they make a shit ton of torque, and it's going to make them feel absolutely effortless, with the caveat being you need adequate state of charge in the battery for the electrical system to do its thing. And I actually got a question from a dude named Nathan Smith, 6914. He was talking in relation to the Ranger with its 697. He said, isn't torque in a ute more important than the power figure though? So maybe it's not as laughably bad as it appears. So yeah, I take your point on that, Nathan. 697 is not laughably bad compared with 650 or 750. But you have to see this kind of stuff in context, because if you drive the Shark 6 and overtake a truck, and you drive the GWM and overtake a truck, they're going to outclass, like massively outclass the Ranger with only 2/3 the peak power, right? So you have to see it in context. And this thing about using torque to be a barometer for mid-range performance, you have to see that in context, and you have to see it between directly comparable vehicles. And I would argue that the Ranger plug-in hybrid is not directly comparable on straight line performance for, say, accelerating flat out because of this, which is massively in the hole compared to the other two, right? So you really have to see that. You have to put it in perspective, and then you have to say, dude, what if the battery goes flat? Because that was a big bone of contention as well for the silver medalist when he did that test, which depleted the battery, and then they put the dyno trailer behind the vehicle, and everyone said, the Shark 6 is shit because it goes badly with the battery flat. Now, that's hardly ever going to happen, but it might. And we need to talk about that too. We'll get to that. So let's think about what happens. I'm not going to so much talk about the Shark 6, but if you're thinking about buying the Ranger plug-in or the GWM, and you want to go off-road and haul your caravan and do all that stuff, how are they going to go with a flat battery? And that's what we're going to concentrate on here. And I'm also going to lay out the mad bare-knuckle physics of all of that. So we know from Ford's press release that 138 kilowatts and 4,600 revs is maximum power with the combustion engine only, i.e. with a flat battery, okay? No electrical contribution from the Ranger plug-in, just the combustion engine. And we also know the peak torque, 411 Newton meters at 2,700. And if we know the mad bare-knuckle physics of conversion, we can turn this into a power figure, because power equals torque times revs. And if you do it properly, you get 116 kilowatts. This is not going to work if you just multiply 411 and 2,700. You'll get an answer that relates to the power. It's just not going to be in units that anyone other than you understand, okay? So if you want to do it quote unquote properly, what you have to do is convert the revs, which are revs per minute, automotive vernacular of revs per minute, and we need to turn it into science vernacular in radians per second. And then we need to convert watts into kilowatts, which involves also dividing by 1,000. So to do that, you need to understand that 1 rev is 2 pi radians. So that's number 2 times number pi, which comes up on the calculator when you're at school, 3.141592654. And then we need to divide by 60 to get minutes into seconds, and then divide by 1,000 to get watts into kilowatts. So that's 2 times pi. And then we need to divide by 60 and divide by 1,000. And if you just said, for an easier way of doing this, you just said that pi is about 3. So if we did that, it's 2 times 3, 2 times about 3, divided by 60, divided by 1,000. Okay, so 6 divided by 60 is division by 10, and division by 1,000 is just divided by 10,000. So we could multiply that by that and then divide by 10,000 and be in the ballpark, and then just ghetto it up a little bit, because pi is a little bit more than 3. There's an even easier way of doing that though, because dividing by 10,000 is dividing by 100 and then dividing by 100, and we could divide that by 100 and get about 4. We could divide that by 100 and get about 27, and 4 times 27 last time I looked was 108, isn't it? 54 times 2 is 108, yes. And then we could just pump it up a little bit, because pi is a bit more than 3, and we get about 115, 116, which would be near enough. And then you could just about do it in your head without your phone, right? If you got your phone though, just ask ChatGPT or Google, and either of those artificially intelligent entities will just whip it out for you, so to speak. And if we do the same thing with the GWM, okay, this is like a life skill. The reason I went through that is because divide that one by 100 and divide that one by 100, multiply them together and pump it up a bit, and you'll be in the ballpark, and your mates will think you're a freaking Jedi, dude. So you can do it with this one as well. We know 380 newton meters. Well, we know the peak power is that 180 at 5,500 to 6,000 with the combustion engine only for the GWM, and we know that corresponds to 380 newton meters between 1,700 and 4,000. And if we do that mad ghetto mathematics, or ask ChatGPT, we get 68 kilowatts at 1,700 RPM and 159 at 4,000. And that is absolutely known, and therefore we know exactly how both of those powertrains are going to perform with a quote-unquote flat battery. And it seems to me that at one point at least, the Ranger is vestigially in front, because it's making more torque at 2,700 RPM than the GWM is going to be making at 2,700 RPM. But it's highly likely that the GWM is going to eclipse it everywhere. And I can look at those numbers and say, yeah, dude, especially after about 3,000 RPM, the GWM is going to crap all over the plug-in hybrid Ranger, which makes me ask myself, how can this one be $25,000 cheaper-ish, spec for spec? So just to paint you the picture of why it's better to compare the GWM and the Ranger with a quote-unquote flat battery, it's because the powertrains of those two vehicles are very similar, and the Shark 6 is not, okay? There is no direct drive from the crankshaft of the Shark 6's 3-cylinder 1.5 engine to the wheels below about 60 or 70 kilometres an hour. This parallel hybrid mode where the combustion engine quote-unquote kicks in does not happen at low speed, okay? And that's because there's no multi-speed transmission. There is a automated clutch, and when you get to the target speed of 60 to 70 kilometres an hour, and if you need the performance of the combustion engine, it can engage one-to-one with the front transaxle and provide direct drive. But it wouldn't be able to sustain the low revs required at lower travelling speeds. And in this respect, it's exactly the same as the Mitsubishi plug-in hybrid EV system in the Outlander and the Eclipse Cross, right? That operates exactly like the Shark 6, whereas the Ranger and the Cannon Alpha both have from 0 to Vmax engagement of the combustion engine with the powertrain via a mechanical drive system comprising multi-speed transmission, and they've got low range and diff locks and things like that. So if you are that beard stroker who just wants to drive through mud and break an axle, then these are the ones for you, dude. This means that the Shark 6 has an imperative, right? It's got a design imperative not to allow the battery to go flat, okay? Because it can't move from stopped if the battery is flat. So if the battery were quote unquote flat, you'd have to start it up. and run the combustion engine as a generator for several minutes. I don't know how long, maybe half an hour, something like that, until the battery were sufficiently charged that the electrical system could make an adequate contribution to forward progress to get you going again, right? Whereas not the case with the Ranger or the Cannon Alpha. They can operate, dead flat, just using the combustion engine. And this, I think, is why Ford made the following statement in its press release. Like all three of these vehicles have 230 volts out, like AC power delivery. And the Ford is currently in front there on having a couple of 15 amp plugs and things of this nature, and the highest rating for the power out of its inverter for 240 volt, 230 volt AC. Incidentally, we all call it 240, but the actual standard is 230 in Australia, and it's been like that for ages. So 230, 240, they're all talking about the same thing, all right? 6.9 kilowatts out of the Ranger versus 6.6 out of the Cannon Alpha, and 3.3 out of the Cannon Alpha and 6.6 out of the Shark. But obviously this is limited by the battery capacity, and the Ranger is kind of outclassed there because about 12 versus about 30 versus about 37. I misremembered when I was writing that down. It's 37.1. But Ford made this statement because there was so much, I'm inferring, because there was so much hubbub about the silver medalists' take on what happens when the Shark 6 goes flat. So they made this statement about the power delivery if you're camped and you're blasting frickin' Celine Dion out over all of the victims who are camped near you, trying to enjoy the quiet and serenity of the great Australian outback. Their dude who's in charge of the program says, we've engineered Pro Power on board, which is their fancy name for 230 volts AC out, for maximum convenience in real-world situations. It functions with the car locked and when it's plugged in to charge, plus if the battery should deplete completely, the 2.3 litre EcoBoost then kicks in to keep everything running. Well, I would argue that the 2.3 litre EcoBoost kind of kicks in all the time anyway to keep everything running, but I suspect Ford decided to make that statement because there was so much furore in the comments after the silver medalist detailed exactly how the Shark 6 performed on a flat battery towing a dyno trailer, which is kind of equivalent to towing a big heavy trailer up a big steep hill. And it didn't do that very well, frankly. Limited to 70 kilowatts, only made 70 kilometres an hour and only made 100 kilowatts. So the performance was mediocre at best, but that's an extreme test. So it wouldn't happen very often, but this is definitely a feather in the cap for the Ranger and the Cannon Alpha because they're not limited in the same way. The Shark 6 requires a minimum state of charge, right? The other two don't. So just harking back to power, so you understand why power actually matters. And there's three reasons, right? The first one is that power really matters for overtaking because if you want to do that flat out acceleration around a truck and you want to be exposed to danger on the wrong side of the road for the least amount of time, then more power is always an advantage. It will get you around the truck or whatever quicker. So Newton's second law says, at least algebraically, that force equals mass times acceleration. Nearly everyone knows that. All it means is that if you get punched in the head, your head accelerates in the direction of the punch, and how hard it accelerates depends on how hard the punch is and how heavy your head is. It's inversely proportional. The acceleration of your head is inversely proportional to its mass and directly proportional to the force. Newton's second law actually says that the time rate of change of momentum of a body acted upon by an unbalanced force is directly proportional to the unbalanced force and inversely proportional to the mass of the body. So there you go. You might want to learn that one and astound your mates as well, but it'll never get you laid. So checks and balances there. You could rearrange this, of course, and you could say that your acceleration is the force divided by the mass. And if we're talking about vehicles doing stuff, overtaking, we could call the force tractive effort because that's what it is. That's the wheels grabbing the road and throwing the vehicle into the future, all right? So the acceleration is dependent on the tractive effort and the mass. Obviously, more tractive effort, more acceleration, heavier vehicle, less. These plug-in hybrids are pretty heavy too, I'd have to say. We also know that power equals force times velocity. That's pretty clear. We could rearrange that in the same way. We get force is power over velocity, and we can stick power over velocity in here instead of force. We can just replace force with that, and we get that your acceleration depends on the power, the velocity, and the mass. Higher speed reduces your acceleration. Okay, this bends people's brains. It does their freaking head in, even though it's a matter of common experience. More power, more acceleration. Higher speed, less acceleration. You don't accelerate as hard at 120 k's an hour when you nail it as you do at 50. That's a matter of common experience, but it does people's head in when you write it down as an equation, all right? More mass, less acceleration. I think most people get that. And of course, none of this accounts for aerodynamic drag. So if you are towing your beautiful aluminium porter slum, you go from 50 to 100, then aerodynamic drag is going to significantly reduce performance as well, and that increases roughly with the square of your velocity. You don't have to think about it that way with Newton, though. There's an alternative way to thinking about it with physics. There's always another way to get there. You could think about it like a drag race, okay? And then you could just think about it in terms of energy and the time rate of change of energy. So we'll do a drag race. We'll go from 0 to 100, which is generally legal on the highway. We're going to go through 50, all right? And I know, and you do now too, that power equals the time rate of change of energy, okay? So it's the amount of energy divided by the time. And you can think about that in average terms, average to get from there to there, you know, how much energy, how much time, or you can take a little snapshot and say, what's the car doing right now? And you could look at it like a little differential wafer, if you remember calculus from high school. So we also know that kinetic energy is a half mv squared, and this is a freaking curse on the universe. Whoever decided that, when I die and go to hell, I'm going to be debating whose idea that was with Satan. Of course, it's a freaking curse, and it should be revised urgently, like several of our laws here on the mortal coil. The V squared is a freaking problem, because if we think about this in terms of the acquisition of energy going from 0 to 100, what it means is that if I've got a vehicle, or you've got your vehicle, and it goes from 0 to 50, we could give that a value. That 50 could be a value for kinetic energy of your vehicle. We'll call it 1 packet, okay? The problem with frickin' V squared is that 100 is twice as fast and 2 squared is 4. So to get to 100, you have to acquire, from 0, you have to acquire 4 packets. So to get from 0 to 50 is the acquisition of 1 packet of energy, and then you need to acquire another 3 frickin' packets of energy to get from 50 to 100, which is completely counterintuitive and makes physics hard to understand for ordinary punters, because superficially it seems like the same job. We're adding 50 and then we're just adding another 50. And it should be simple, but it's freaking not. We've got 1 packet of energy and then 3 packets of energy, and this is why it's harder to get from 50 to 100, and it takes longer than it is to get from 0 to 50. And V squared, incidentally, is also a freaking curse for braking, because you see a problem in front. It's 100 metres away, you're doing 100 k's an hour, you jam on the brakes, you might just stop in time, but let's say you've only got 75 metres to stop and the stopping distance is 100. Okay, you jam on the brakes and you do 75 metres, so you've covered 3/4 of the frickin' distance that it takes to stop, but you've still got half your speed, right? You wash off half your speed in the last quarter of your stop because someone in hell decided to make energy proportional to V squared. And that, dude, it's a curse on the operation of the frickin' universe, and it affects all of us and it needs to change. The third reason that power matters is driving uphill, dude. More power means that when you are towing your beautiful porter slum with your beautiful wife and her 2 containers of light and easy cuisine and the sprogs trying to fight each other in the back seat, he's touching me, are we there yet? All of that. Living the dream, I would argue. if you're driving up this really steep hill, towing your Chitois with your beautiful plug-in hybrid ute, if it's got more power, then you'll be able to achieve a higher constant speed driving up that hill. That's just how this frickin' works, okay? I know that when you're driving up the hill, you've got tractive effort and you've got all these resistances. You've got gravity and you've got aerodynamic drag of the vehicle and the Chitois, and you've got rolling resistance and all of that stuff, okay? But if you're doing a constant speed, then the tractive effort and the resistance are balanced. That's Newton's first law, which says that in a balanced force system, the time rate of change of momentum is zero. And this is balanced because that equals that, okay? And we also know that power is force times velocity. So if you've got more power, then you just drive up the hill at a higher speed, right? That's how this works. And that does people's head in as well. They go, well, how does that actually work, right? You've experienced this every time you've gone for a drive on the freeway, because let's say you're driving along the flat at 100 and then you get to a hill. We've all done that. And then your speed drops down a little bit. You might look down and you might see that you're doing 80 because you've got more resistance. So your speed has dropped and you're in this balanced force system because you're doing a constant speed of 80, but you want to do 100. So what do? You go like this. And this is you telling a computer that you'd like more power from the engine, if that's okay, kind of thing, right? So the engine responds by sucking in more air and delivering more fuel and burning it and giving you more torque at the crank, which at those revs means more power, okay? Because power equals torque times revs. What happens when you do that? You get brief acceleration, but it doesn't go forever, because you've only, put your foot down a little bit. You only want to do 100, not 160, because you don't want your license to go on holiday. So you accelerate briefly and then you get to a balancing speed where once again your tractive effort and your resistance are equivalent, don't you? That's how physics works. You've experienced it the whole time. You've just never thought about it like that. So your travel speed up any hill is dependent on how much power you can produce. And what actually happens here is that in extremis with a flat battery, then you might be milking that engine for all it's worth. And in that case, if it's on the limit, giving all it can, little frickin' engine that could kind of stuff, then you're going to be at a higher speed if you've got more combustion engine performance. And I would argue that at most revs, the GWM is dramatically in front of the Ranger, although this is not straightforward either. We'll get to that. So here's what we know. We converted using that mad equation about multiplying by 2 and multiplying by pi and dividing by 60 and dividing by 1,000, or if you just want to cheat it, you divide by 10,000 and suck it and see, and then add a bit. Well, these are the numbers that we know. The GWM's the red curve. It's the power curve, right, based on the 1,700 and 4,000 RPM maximum torque figures, right? And then the maximum power of 180 between 5,500 and 6,000. That's what the GWM is. And the solid line is the bit we know, and the bit we know here. And there's got to be a contiguous sort of join between these two bits. So a little curvy line here. We don't know what its shape is exactly, and we don't know what its shape is exactly down here either. One thing we know about the Ranger is that it's making just ever so slightly, bee's dick, slightly, more torque than the GWM at 2,700 RPM, because at 2,700, the GWM is making 380 Newton meters, right? The Ranger's making 411. So if you graph it as power, the Ranger is slightly above at 2,700 on a flat battery, okay? Just slightly above. But I'm not sure that that's such an advantage, because this is a bee's dick advantage just here. It's 411 Newton meters versus 380 at the same RPM. It's slightly in front, foot mashed to the boards, right? What you've got with the GWM is you've got this massive night and day total eclipse of the Ranger from, I'm guessing, 3,000, 3,200, something like that. It's just going to take a giant steaming dump all over the Ranger in extremis with a flat battery, because this is massive that's a bee's dick. This does not compensate for that. And that's why you can't just say that torque is more important than power. If you drill down into it, power is always the preeminent thing. And if you just want to do a quick ghetto hack, you can look at the peak torque, and if the vehicles are directly comparable, then you can infer something about the mid RPM power delivery, right? But these vehicles are not directly comparable. This is not what directly comparable looks like, okay? And then, of course, if the battery does have a sufficient state of charge and you want to go flat out, then you got 207 kilowatts from the Ranger versus 300 from the GWM. The GWM goes 50% harder flat out. That's unarguable. And even if there's a couple of 100 kilograms in it of curb weight, which there probably is, that doesn't compensate for that either, right? It just doesn't. And the torque is the same, 750 for the GWM versus 697. That's only 8%, but it's still substantial. And it doesn't explain, in my mind at least, how in hell the Ranger's price of $25,000 more, spec for spec, can be in any way justified or construed as being quote unquote good value. The final thing I want to talk to you about here is what happens to the battery when you're going flat out, because that's worthy of consideration as well. I think one thing that the deployment of EVs on the world has taught us all is that if you charge or discharge a battery very quickly, then that interferes with that battery's life, longevity, okay? Charging and discharge rates are important to understand, and here it's not perfectly straightforward either, because if you look at the peak power for the Ford of 207 kilowatts, it's getting 138 from the maximum in the combustion engine. And that means if the two peaks align, 138, and the missing amount is going to be 79 from the electrical side, right? So the battery is going to have to discharge at a rate, like energy per unit time, of 79 kilowatts, right? To give you the total. There's no other way this can happen. And if the peaks do not align, like if the peak power of the system is not at the peak power of the EcoBoost engine, then that's going to be higher than 79 kilowatts here. Like, it's a zero-sum game, right? GWM, same sort of thing, because 180 kilowatts plus 120 from the electrical side equals 300 kilowatts. And you say, shit, man, the GWM is producing a ton more electrical power than the Ford. But then you have to say, how big is the battery? Because the battery in the Ford is 11.8 and the battery in the GWM is like 37.1. 11.8, 37.1. So what's happening inside the battery is the battery is just this box and it's got a bunch of chemicals in it and they have to react to produce the power. So more power, faster reaction. That's how batteries work. Less power, like a little trickle, slower reaction, lasts for a longer time. Everyone gets that. So the mass of the battery, like the amount of reactive mass in the battery, really matters. And there's a discharge rate, right? So 79 divided by 11.8 is 6.7 C worth of discharge rate. 120 kilowatts from the GWM divided by its battery, 37.1, is a discharge rate of 3.2. So when you crank the Ranger plug-in hybrid, even though it's only producing 2/3 of the electrical power, its little tiny battery comparatively is actually churning and burning more than twice as hard as the battery in the GWM. And I don't know about you, but just off the bat, I'd be concerned that if I drive like a cut snake all the time, that's going to have a more significant impact on the Ranger than it is on the GWM. And anyway, you don't have to drive if we're driving at an equivalent pace, the Ranger flat out is 79 kilowatts-ish from the electrical side, whereas the GWM, matching the Ranger's performance, is only going to take like 27 kilowatts, not 120, right? So neck and neck on a drag race, the battery in the GWM is just going, yeah, I could do this all day kind of thing. Whereas the battery in the Ford is the little engine that could, is pumping as hard as it freaking can. And in extremis, flat out in a drag race where the GWM just rips away and you see the Ranger well behind in the rear vision mirror by the time you get to 400 metres, that battery is honking in the Ford to do that more than twice as hard as the battery in the GWM. And look, if you want a drag race, then Shark 6, because it's got slightly more power. It's got 321 kilowatts, so it'll probably win every drag race. But if you do want to do four-wheel driving, beard stroking, ute riding high, nut swinging low underneath your beer gut kind of operations with your upcoming new plug-in hybrid dual cab, I think on paper there is a clear winner, and it's not the Ranger and it's not the Shark 6, it's the GWM, because its specifications on paper are so significantly in front of the other two for those caravan toting, hill climbing, sand dune beating, whatever kind of operations, that it's pretty clearly a winner. Although I'd suggest why not just buy a diesel and pocket the change kind of thing. But if you do want to drive for the other 48 weeks of the year when you're not on annual leave, just in EV mode to pretend to be somehow planet-saving and virtuous, then the concept of a plug-in hybrid EV ute actually does make pretty good sense. And it might save you some money too, especially if you plug in and recharge faithfully every evening and you use off-peak electricity to do it. That's going to be cheaper than liquid fuel.